All right, some business news now as we trickle out of the holiday season. Business picking up ever so slightly as we get into the middle part of January. Let's start with this. Medicine prices in South Africa's private sector are tightly regulated by the Health Department. Now, the department allows for one upward adjustment a year. But pharmaceutical manufacturers are not happy with the latest increase for 2023, suggesting it may be too small to cover their costs. Now, I want to bring in Stavros Nicolaou. He's the chairperson of the Pharmaceutical Task Group. Stavros, thanks very much indeed for talking to us. I mean, before we get into the detail of this particular story, just help us understand how price increases for medicines are determined. I mean, as I understand it, it comes from consultations between you and government, isn't it?
Devin, firstly, thanks very much for having us on your show this early in the year. As you correctly point out, medicine prices in the private sector, and I must stress this is the private sector we're referring to, are regulated by the Department of Health. There's a once-a-year increase. That increase usually happens in January, as was the case this year. It is usually subject to some form of consultation, and there's a tacit agreement or understanding around a formula that gets used to arrive at the final percentage. That formula traditionally has been a 70% attributable to consumer price index and 30% around currency movements, and that's how the final determination is made. The consultations historically have been very good because we've largely found each other as to what is an appropriate percentage. Of course, that picture has changed somewhat this year, and we were rather surprised to receive a 3.28% increase when I think everyone knows CPI is at around a 7% mark at the moment.
And I want to get to the heart of that issue in a moment, but this, I would imagine, Stavros, relates to everything from cough syrup to high-end medication. Do I understand that correctly?
Devin, not entirely. This refers to anything that is a scheduled medicine.
Yep.
Some of these scheduled medicines, of course, are purchased over the counter. So it refers to any scheduled medicine in the country, the majority of which is either dispensed by a pharmacist as a Schedule 2, as we call it, or alternatively your prescription medicines you would receive at the dispensary checkpoint.
Mm-hmm. So let's get to the heart of the issue. Now, you were saying those increases that were put forward, I think it's around about 3.2% or thereabout, as a maximum cap for you as an industry to increase prices. You were saying it's too small because that price doesn't make it viable to produce the product. Is that the essence of the argument here?
It is, and there's a slight amplification of that, in that what one tries to achieve with a price increase every year, and we're not insensitive to the plight of the funders. It's primarily the funders here because they are the ones that pay out 85 to 90% of medicines that are reimbursed. There's about 10 or 15%, the remainder that's not funded through medical schemes, and those are what we call out-of-pocket expenses. So the majority of these medicines will be reimbursed by your medical schemes. So what we always try and achieve is a balance between access to medicines and affordability on the one hand, but then on the other hand, an industry that is sustainable, because the cost of withdrawing medicines from the market is exceedingly and far more costly than if you take a slightly higher price increase. So the cost of hospitalization far outstrips the cost of a patient not being able to access a medicine. And we've kind of seen in other markets, I mean, Greece right now, I was just curious because the Greek foreign minister is visiting South Africa later this month. Greece is having shortages of medicines at the moment, and it's precisely because of the reason that the prices have been driven too low. They become unsustainable, and hence patients cannot access these medicines. So what we strive to do every year, and we will try and do so again this year, is strike that balance between access to medicines, but also keeping these medicines viable and sustainable so you can continue supplying them to patients. And I should also hasten to add, I think we saw the consequences globally during the pandemic when medicines become inaccessible, as was the case with vaccines on the African continent, by way of example. The consequences to mortality and morbidity statistics are not very good. So we will be approaching the minister himself, the pricing committee and the department to have this conversation and try and understand why was there on this occasion a deviation from the standard formula and practice that we've employed for over 2 decades now.
It's a tight balance, Stavros, I can imagine, and it's also a very difficult financial time for consumers, where paying more to attend to the sick is the last thing consumers need. How do you argue against that? That might be a bit difficult. I mean, it's a social issue as well, isn't it?
Look, it's a socio-economic issue, actually, because, you know, these businesses, whether they import medicines or produce medicines locally in South Africa, are subject to the same inflationary pressures as any other business would be. And I think you'd find very few people disagreeing that, you know, getting 50% or less of the current inflation doesn't augur well for long-term sustainability of these businesses, in particular long-term sustainability of medicine supply. So I think the balance that we always seek is to be at around the CPI mark. Being at around CPI, of course, then means that you can strike that balance. And also just remembering that funders are taking increases way beyond inflation at the moment, to the funders of the medical schemes. So we weigh all of these different elements, but our first priority as a pharmaceutical industry is to ensure that we are sustainable so we can supply medicines at affordable and accessible prices to patients and consumers and, of course, the funders.
All right. And just as I let you go, Stavros, I mean, you called it puzzling, this latest increase, which you, I mean, suggesting that it's just too low for viability. Why is it puzzling to you? And what's your first words when you sit down with government in the coming days on this one?
I think it's puzzling because we've had a formula that's been largely agreed. And of course, that's what one always looks for. One looks for certainty and predictability. And so, because these are businesses like any other businesses, they incur, you know, they're subject to the same inflationary pressures that any other business is. So we've had for over 2 decades now a tried and tested formula, and that got you out to, you know, around about CPI, there or thereabouts. So to have come in this year at less than half or just under 50% of CPI is the puzzling bit. I also noted that the ministry spokesperson, Mr. Foster Mahale, earlier mentioned that the formula was applied or seems to have been applied again this year. So application of the formula doesn't get you anywhere near 3.28%. So our discussions with the department will, as always, be constructive, will be collegial, as they've been over the last 2 decades. And we will try and get to the bottom of how did we arrive at this 3.28%. Of course, we will plead our case with respect to sustainability, because there's no bigger tragedy than when patients can't access medicines at all. You know, you can have the best diagnosticians anywhere in the world, but if you can't prescribe or medicines are inaccessible, then you're kind of defeating the purpose. So those are some of the conversations, but again, constructively and collegially, we'll be having with the department.
Stavros Nicolaou, the chair of the Pharmaceutical Task Group, thanks very much indeed for your time there. Well, there you have it, Brad. And I mean, as we said, it's a tough one. The last thing you need, because your shopping list, your fuel list and everything else is rising. I mean, just having a debate around this could be somewhat pressurizing for consumers, but it's good to see that it's being handled in some way?
They're trying to handle it as sensibly as they can because the cost of living spiked so much for all of us in 2022. Thank you very much, Devin Murugan. Good luck to the pharmaceutical industry as it engages the Department of Health to ensure that the prices of medicines that we all need at one point or another in our lives remain reasonable.